Thank you, Raghu, Lekha, and Ravi. It's a great honor to be on this platform today and speak about Professor Kalburgi. Today is the fifth death anniversary of Professor Kalburgi. He was shot dead at his residence in Dharwad in the early hours of 30th August 2015. That was also Sunday. The news of his death came as a matter of shock and disbelief for many of us. Kalburgi shot dead. This was the first response that most of us had. 5 years later, the investigation has not made much headway. The murderers continue to be at large. And 5 years later, Kalburgi's work is still largely unknown to the academic world outside of Karnataka. Even within Karnataka, see, all that we hear is that he was a prolific scholar, a genius, the author of more than 100 books, etc. So far as I can tell, his contribution to knowledge are yet to be taken up for serious appraisal. I have seen a handful of papers in English translation in the last 5 years, but I must say it is the most insignificant of his works that have appeared in English. That is really unfortunate. On his death, the media represented him as a rationalist. Because the media, as well as the people, always want to label, you see. Unless they place people in very familiar categories, they cannot make sense of anything. And an impression began to circulate that Kalburgi was a camp follower of Ingersoll, Abraham Kovu, Narendra Davulkar. That was hardly the case. He was a practicing Lingayat, a devout Lingayat, a Puritan Lingayat, I would say, so Puritan that he never accepted any aspect of the Lingayat faith that did not figure in the Vachanas of Basava and his 12th century contemporaries. This made him a radical of sorts. And for this reason, he was often at loggerheads with the Lingayat orthodoxy, because the orthodoxy was generally directed by established conventions and not necessarily by what is written in the Vachanas. On one occasion, the orthodoxy found one of his papers really blasphemous. He was summoned to the Muruga Mata in Dharwad, humiliated, forced to withdraw the paper. He declared that on this day he had committed intellectual suicide. That's a very famous statement that he made. Kalburgi generally identified himself with progressive politics. He was deeply sympathetic towards Marxism. He was not a Marxist himself, but Marxists were among some of his best friends. And one of his cherished Marxist friends was shot dead only 6 months before Kalburgi was shot dead, Govind Pansare. And police investigation has shown that both of them were shot with the same pistol. Kalburgi, Malleshappa Madivalappa Kalburgi, was born on 28th November 1938. He was born in a small village called Gubbewada. Gubbewada is about 75 kilometers to the north of the town of Sindagi in the Bijapur district. It is on the Bhima River on the Karnataka-Maharashtra border. His mother, Guramma, came from this village. He spent his childhood in Yeragal, which is closer to Sindagi. It is about 6 or 7 miles to the east of Sindagi. His father belonged to this place. He came from a peasant family. It was a joint family. There were about 20 members in the family. His primary schooling happened, the first few years happened in Yeragal and then in Sindagi. He went to Bijapur for high school and undergraduate education. I don't think he had a great schooling or college education, although he was often the best in the class. But he had a wonderful teacher in his BA days in Vijaya College in Bijapur. That was Beti Shasanur. Being in Bijapur also helped him to establish contacts with the first modern scholar of Vachana literature, Phagu Halakatti. It was Halakatti and Shasanur who advised Kalburgi to go to Dharwad for his MA. Kalburgi went to Dharwad, where he took his MA from Karnataka University with a gold medal. He did his PhD in Kannada from the same university. His doctoral thesis was on Kannada literature in the age of Kaviraja Marga. It was published as a book in 1973. Kaviraja Marga Parisarada Kannada Sahitya is what it is called. Dharwad provided Kalburgi with a very different intellectual climate vis-a-vis Bijapur. This little city with wonderful weather throughout the year is. I don't know if the weather is still the same. I haven't been to Dharwad for ages now. But the city is situated at a point where the Western Ghats come to an end and the plains to the east begin. It had a history that went back to the times of the Kalyana Chalukyas, more than 800 years. When the British decided to move their capital from Calcutta in 1912, the names of 5 cities were proposed for the new seat of the Raj. Dharwad was apparently one of them. I'm not very sure about this. I haven't looked up the documents. I get this information from an article that the late Kannada critic Kirtinatha Kurtukoti had once written. As early as the last quarter of the 19th century, Dharwad had emerged as what shall I call it? As the nerve center, maybe the nerve center of intellectual life in Karnataka. Raha Deshpande had established the Karnataka Vidyavardhaka Sangha in the city. That was in 1890. The Sangha provided the platform for the earliest demands of the Ekikarana movement. That is a movement for unification of all Kannada-speaking areas into a single administrative province. Benegal Ramarao had made this demand in 1903. He was the first one to propose the idea in Karnataka. And S.S. Sethlur made the demand once again in 1906. In 1907, Alur Venkatrao gave out a call for unification. He made this call in an article that he wrote in the Vidyavardhaka Sangha's mouthpiece, Vagbhushana. And he was on the forefront of the unification movement. The Vidyavardhaka Sangha had built a wonderful library. And a large number of people who lived in Dharwad and who went on to pursue careers in research and teaching began their research at this library. My own research began there. When I lived in Hubli from 1996 to 2001, the Vidyavardhaka Sangha library was the place where I went to access research material. Hubli is about 20 kilometers southeast of Dharwad. I would take a train from Hubli to Dharwad and travel for free because I was a railway employee and had a free travel pass. When Kalburgi came to Dharwad in 1960, the city was home to some of the best intellectuals and writers in Karnataka. Not all of them living in Dharwad, but many of them had associations as well with Dharwad. The poet Dara Bendre lived there. And there were several other major writers, Channa Veera Kanavi, Girish Karnad, G.B. Joshi. Joshi had in fact started the Manohar Granthamala, which is a very leading publisher in Kannada. Most of Girish Karnad's plays and the poems, the Kannada poems of A.K. Ramanujan were published from Manohar Granthamala, and an amazing number of works that Kirtinath Kurtakoti wrote was also published from Manohar. An amazing number of stalwarts, and an amazing number of them from various fields were associated with Dharwad. Fagu Halakatti, who lived in Bijapur, but he was born in Dharwad. The freedom fighter N.S. Hardekar, G.A. Kulkarni, the Marathi novelist, the English novelist Shashi Deshpande, the engineer P.K. Kelkar, who was the first director of IIT Kanpur, and a host of musicians. Basavaraja Rajaguru, Savai Gandharva, Mallikarjun Mansur, who else? Panchakshari Mattigatti, Sangameshwara Guru, that is Kaivalya Kumar Guru's father, Bhim Sen Joshi. One can also include Gangubai Hangal. She lived in Hubli, not in Dharwad. And when Kalburgi reached Dharwad, some of the best intellectuals in Karnataka were living there. Shamba Joshi, Kurtakoti, C.N.S. Iyengar, P.B. Desai, V.R. Panchamukhi, R.C. Hiremat, who was Kalburgi's PhD supervisor as well. M.K. Naik, who wrote the most popular textbook on the history of Indian writing in English. What a city. This is not Delhi, this is not Calcutta, not Madras. This is a small, easygoing city, you see. The 1961 census actually tells you that the population was only 77,000. You know? Now, it was easy for Kalburgi to get a gold medal in his MA, and he had great classmates and juniors, and some of them went on to become leading intellectuals and writers in the coming decades. Chandrasekhar Patil, for instance, or Siddhalinga Pattanashetty, Giradi Govindaraju. They had long hours of conversation every day, but doctoral research turned out to be trickier than Kalburgi had expected. As he commenced research, Kalburgi often met with two strange questions. What is your hypothesis? And what is your method? These questions actually came from professors in disciplines that did not have a department in Carnatic University until 1957. Sociology, philosophy, and English. These are new departments. But the Kannada department was old, and it was as old as the university, 1949. And the Kannada Research Institute, which eventually became a part of the university, was even older. It was founded in 1939. Kalburgi was not familiar with the idea of a hypothesis or the idea of a research method. His education in Yaragal and Sindagi and Bijapur had not prepared him for this kind of an intellectual life. Most doctoral research in the older departments, people will tell you, followed established models of thesis writing. Hypotheses and methods were totally alien to these models. In fact, there is a joke about research in the university. The chemistry department in Dharwad is older than the university. It was originally a postgraduate center of the University of Bombay. The joke is that a PhD thesis was valid only if it begins by making a reference to the Rig Veda. A research scholar had joined the chemistry department to pursue his PhD. This was the age of atomic energy and the atom bomb. Uranium was very much in demand. So the scholar wanted to work on uranium enrichment. He began work, he worked on it for 5 years, wrote his thesis, took the first draft to his supervisor. The supervisor read the first page and he was restless. He read the second page, the third page. By the time he was beginning to look at the fourth page, he was absolutely furious. He told the scholar, "This is not done. How can you write a PhD thesis without mentioning the Rig Veda in the beginning?" This scholar didn't know of this convention. He had not read the Rig Veda either, but he stood his ground. He said, "I read the Rig Veda not once or twice, but 3 times, but I did not find any reference in it to the uranium." The supervisor said, "That is impossible." The boy insisted, he kept on insisting, and the supervisor was eventually convinced that there is no uranium in the Rig Veda. So he asked the scholar to produce a new draft of the thesis in which he will state categorically in the very first sentence that there is no reference to uranium in the Rig Veda. This is the kind of research that Kalburgi would have otherwise done. Thanks to those strange professors in English, sociology, philosophy, he wanted a hypothesis now. The idea of a hypothesis did not appeal to him very much. He wanted one, but he was willing to work without one. But the question of a research method had a tremendous impression on him. That's when he began to read more and more works in English to redress his English language deficit. He met G.S. Dikshit of the history department. Dikshit advised Kalburgi to have a good sense of history before studying pre-modern literature. He urged him to read Vincent Smith's Early History of India and Nilakanta Shastri's History of South India. Kalburgi read Shastri's book, but he couldn't read more than the first 100 pages of Smith's book. He also met P.B. Desai, again from the history department, who gave him the manuscript of a history of Karnataka, which Desai had written jointly with Srinivasa Ritti and B.R. Gopal. The book was not published yet. Desai also told him to read a new book that had appeared in the meantime. This was E.H. Carr's What is History? Kalburgi read the book, and ever since he's been fond of citing a line from the book. He would tell his students, research is an unending dialogue between the past and the present. You know, E.H. Carr had written that history is an unending dialogue. Kalburgi completed his MA in 1962. Just give me a moment. His MA was in 1962. That year, the School of Foreign Languages was established in Karnataka University. It became the Department of Foreign Languages in 1970 or 71, I guess, 70 perhaps. Sridhar Shrotri joined the school as lecturer in German in 1962. Kalburgi met him. Shrotri urged Kalburgi to expand his readings beyond Kannada literature and history. He told him to begin with Weber and Durkheim. Kalburgi read Weber, Elementary Forms of Religious Life. He found it thoroughly boring, and then he read The Protestant Ethic. He had a feeling that this book would change his life, largely because he was a Lingayat, and the Lingayat faith has often been compared to Protestant Christianity. He read the book and realized that what the book had to say was completely unconvincing. But he was impressed by the manner in which Weber had woven an account centering on this idea of calling, the famous Calvinist idea, you know. It was as if a storm had broken in his mind. This is what he once told me. He realized that there was a method for him here. Identify key expressions, look for them in the sources, understand their distribution pattern geographically as well as chronologically. In the next few years, 1963, 64 to about 1970 or so, his conversations with the most intellectuals who were in Dharwad revolved around the possibility of developing the rather vague idea that he had into a clearly defined method. He could see that Shamba Joshi was obsessed with etymology and tracing the roots of words across languages, across geographies, across centuries. That was Shamba's method. Shamba would write about the Vedas and the Puranas, the Vachanas, the Varkari tradition, the Bhakti tradition, the pharaohs of Egypt, Greek tragedy, Lao Tse, Confucius, Gilgamesh, Dionysus, just about anything, you know. The Mayans, the Incas, St. Augustine, Wittgenstein, Karl Popper, Spinoza. It's very difficult to understand Shamba. I'm of the view that there are only two other texts ever written that are more difficult to comprehend than the writings of Shamba Joshi. One is the body of Vachanas that Allama Prabhu wrote. The other is Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. Shamba is number 3. Shamba introduced Kalburgi to the hermeneutics of Martin Heidegger. I don't think the English translations of Heidegger were available anywhere in Dharwad in the 1960s, but Shamba knew German, and German was also taught in the Karnataka University. Now, Kalburgi made copious notes on Heideggerian hermeneutics from the informal tuitions he had from Shamba. He never got to read Heidegger himself. What is interesting is that he never got into the meat of Heidegger's hermeneutics. Instead, he was impressed by the use of etymology as a method and Heidegger's ideas concerning death, primarily the ideas on the relationship between time and death. Kalburgi could very easily connect it with the Indian word Kala. Kala means time, Kala also means death. And after this, death became for Kalburgi an abiding area of research interest. He wrote a number of papers on death, the Jaina notions of death, the Jaina practice of death, that is voluntary termination of life, ideas concerning death in the Vachanas, the representation of death in literary texts, such as the works of Pampa and Ranna and Brahma Shiva, death on the battlefield, suicide by loyal servants when their masters die, it is called Velewali. All these came from his conversation with Shamba on Heidegger. In the second half of 1960s, he had a series of interactions with A.K. Ramanujan. From him, Kalburgi learned the basics of Russian formalism, particularly the theories of Roman Jakobson. Now, Jakobson had spoken of 6 different functions of language. You know, the referential function, the aesthetic, the emotive, the conative, the metalingual, and there is one more I'm forgetting, the phatic function. Kalburgi's reflections on these made him draw the conclusion that the referential and aesthetic functions are not mutually exclusive. The referential function had to do with the context, the aesthetic function had to do with the message. These were not different from each other. Kalburgi did not take the other four functions seriously as they were not very important for his own research. And when he spoke to me about this in 2005, he had actually already forgotten what the four other functions were. Kalburgi now had a method, a context-sensitive study of language with focus on historically significant words, their etymology, and the pattern of their occurrence in history, which is to say their geographical and chronological distribution. This is one of the most refined methods that one can think of. One only needs to read a handful of papers that Kalburgi wrote to understand how effective the method was. I would go to the extent of saying that Kalburgi and Shamba Joshi were the only researchers in Canada in the last 100 years to have had a method, a research method, a well-defined, a clear research method. The rest of them are all either mere data collection or kite flying kind of generalizations, you see. I had once asked Kalburgi what his method was. That was in one of our first conversations. I had only read two or three of his articles at the time, and my interest in research had just begun. I asked Kalburgi, "What's your method?" He said, "I look for words. I look for words. The words are innocent, but there is a clamor in that innocence. ಶಬ್ದಗಳು ಮುಗ್ಧವಾಗಿರ್ತಾವ ಆದ್ರೆ ಆ ಮುಗ್ಧತೆ ಏನದಲ್ಲ ಅದ್ರ ಒಳಗನ ಒಂದು ಚೀರಾಟ ಇರ್ತೈತಿ. There is a clamor in the innocence of words. I listen to that clamor. That's my method." This is what he said. uh, I'll now say a few words about his career and research interests. Kalburgi was appointed as lecturer in Canada in Karnataka University, Dharwad, in 1962. As soon as he had completed his MA, he moved to Karnataka University in 1966 and taught there until 1998. In this period, about a period of about 32 years, he served as head of the department on one occasion, and also held the chair in honor of Basava, the Basava Pita. This was from 1980 to 1988. He started a diploma program in Basava studies from the Basava Pita. The Kannada department of the University of Karnataka University had a syllabus with subjects only related to study of literary texts. Kalburgi changed this. Kalburgi introduced several new subjects in the department: research methods, manuscriptology, epigraphy, and he trained a large number of students to explore aspects of history of language and religion in Karnataka, particularly religion. I cannot really say that these students produced remarkable pieces of research, but it brought out new information about a number of traditions that nobody in the Kannada public sphere had heard of before the 1980s. The traditions of Kodekallu, the traditions of Tintini, Shirahatti, Savalagi, many such traditions. He started a publication in which university students wrote papers, a quarterly called the Vidyarthi Bharati. He also started an annual conference on folk traditions. It began in 1973, and I think it still continues to be held every year. 1998 was the year when he was appointed as Vice Chancellor of Kannada University, Hampi. He was Vice Chancellor until 2001. He was the second VC of the university. He was great in financial management as well. In its initial years, the university had incurred a huge amount of debt. Kalburgi raised funds, cleared the loan, and put in place a remarkable infrastructure for the university. As we see, he strengthened the Prasaranga, which is the publication division of the university. He laid very strong foundations for the Prasaranga, and today the Kannada University Prasaranga is the most prolific and vibrant of all the university Prasarangas that you have in Karnataka. Kalburgi initiated the process of publishing the inscriptions of northern Karnataka district-wise on the lines of Epigraphia Karnataka that we have for South Karnataka. And he initiated the publication of Persian and Arabic inscriptions of the region, Kannada inscriptions from Maharashtra and Andhra. In the course of his career, he brought out critical editions of several literary works that were not known until then. He found the manuscripts, he acquired them for the university, he edited them critically. He compiled the Kaifiyats of Karnataka and published a critical edition. He published popular editions as well, popular editions of Vachanas in multiple volumes and the hagiographic poems or ragales of Harihara. He also brought out the collected works of the writer Basavaraja Kattimani and the collected works of Halakatti as well. Kalburgi wrote a very important textbook on textual criticism in Kannada that turned out to be very helpful for scholars who were involved in producing critical editions of older texts. And you had the Basava Samiti in Bangalore, and on behalf of the Basava Samiti, he published a volume of 2,500 vachanas and oversaw a massive project of translating this volume into as many languages as possible. All South Asian languages and a few others as well, French, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese. So we now have the vachanas in English, Tamil, Telugu, Hindi, Urdu, Marathi, Odia, Bengali. There are two more, Sanskrit and Punjabi. Yeah, the work is still in progress, and translations are now being made into Assamese, Malayalam, Kashmiri, Bodo, a translation into Bodo, translation into Santhal, Sindhi, Nepali. This work is still going on. Kalburgi encouraged a number of Lingayat mathas to involve themselves in academic publication. The research output from the mathas was not very encouraging, but the mathas published a number of primary sources, such as Tattvapadas, Dangurapadas, Kaivalya literature, and a host of such works. The Veerashaiva Adhyayana Samsthe of the Tontadarya Mutt in Gadag is perhaps the most prolific among them. And that's how we got to know of the works of someone like, say, Salatugi Channabasava, for instance, or Somekatte Channavira, Neeralakere Basavalinga, Veera Sangaya, Ainoli Bakkapaya, Kestura Deva. The Kannada University, Hampi Prasaranga also facilitated this process and published a large number of works that were not known until then. The works of Kodaikallu Basava, the works of Rachappaji, and texts such as Chidananda Vaduta Charitra, Savalagi Shivalingeshwara Charite, and many more. Kalburgi's studies were directed to an understanding of the history of language, literature, and religious life in pre-colonial Karnataka. He was not trained as a historian. He was not familiar with historical methods. The method that he used, as we saw, was his own creation. Rarely did he engage with advances in theory. We must be thankful to him for not doing so. Otherwise, he would be talking like an average Delhi-based university professor, you see, telling us that it's all about power, it's discursive, one has to get into the discourse, it's all about hegemony. I'm trying to think through a certain number of complex issues that are always already configured in a certain manner, largely to figure out how the whole thing is constantly negotiated. This is your intellectual output most of the time. Kalburgi also did not engage with historical research of the last 4 decades, except, of course, the works of Richard Eaton, Sheldon Pollock, and David Lorenzen. That's another reason why his works are so rich, novel, fruitful. We don't find him talking about power, ideology, legitimation, integrative polity, feudalism, and so on, which historians have been waxing eloquent for almost half a century now. In his writings, we find an original mind at work, coming up with remarkable findings. In the years when he was developing his method, Kalburgi read all published literary works in Kannada from the earliest of times to the end of the 13th century, which included the Kaviraja Margam, Shabdamani Darpanam, Karnataka Bhasha Bhushanam, and other such texts on poetics and grammar, Champu Kavyas, the Champu Kavyas of Pampa, Ranna, the Vachanas, the Ragales of Harihara, the early Shatpadi Kavyas. He also studied a number of works from later times, the works of poets such as Kumaravyasa, Lakshmisha, Chamarasa, Kanakadasa, Ratnakaravarni, and many more. And Kalburgi had read all inscriptions from Karnataka published until then. In fact, he was perhaps the only person who could tell us how many Gosasa inscriptions there are in Karnataka, how many hero stones are found with inscriptions engraved on them, how many inscriptions that speak of the Velewali, for instance. Which inscription mentions localities such as, say, the Puligere Nadu or Sagara Nadu or Santalige for the first time? We must remember that there are more than 10,000 inscriptions in Karnataka. Kannada scholars put the number at 25,000. It was said of Kalburgi that while most serious researchers in Dharwad read one book after another, Kalburgi read one shelf of books after another. In the course of his career, Kalburgi discovered several works of literature that were unknown until then. Texts like the Kumara Ramana Sangatya or Nimba Samanta Charite, Sirumana Sangatyagalu, Siddhamanka Charite, Gunda Basaveshwara Charite, many more, Immadi Chikka Bhupala Sangatya. He published critical editions of these texts. I have already told you about that. His essays were compiled together in Marga, a collection of essays in 8 volumes. One of them, Marga 4, brought him the Kendra Sahitya Academy Award in 2006. He was also a recipient of a number of other awards. The Pampa Award, the Pampa Award of the Department of Kannada and Culture, the Nripatunga Award given by the Kannada Sahitya Parishad, Basava Puraskara of the Government of Karnataka, the Nadoja Award of Kannada University, and many more. Language was the organizing principle of his thought, not language in the abstract, but specific languages that were historically situated. He believed that the structure of language determined the process of cognition and reflection. He would go to the extent of declaring that for this reason, each language community has a distinct way of thinking. On one occasion, he wrote that people who spoke the Dravidian languages had a particular pattern of thinking, and that the Tamil text Chilappadigaram embodied this pattern. At times, he would get excited about such ideas. He once wrote that Karnataka, Andhra, and Kerala must change their names so that all Dravidian provinces will have the same pattern of identification. Tamil Nadu and Tudu Nadu were his models. So he said Andhra should become Telugu Nadu, Karnataka should become Kannada Nadu, and Kerala renamed as Malayala Nadu, or Malayalam language renamed as Kerala Bhasha. His appeal to language came from 2 sources. One, the Lingayat community to which he belonged. This community had recognized the Vachanas written in Kannada as their most sacred texts. The Lingayats had many Sanskrit texts which they revered, but the Vachanas in Kannada had a primacy over them. 2, when the linguistic state of Karnataka was created in 1956, it was then called Mysore. The state was renamed as Karnataka in 1972. In 1956, Kalburgi was 18 years old. He was very perceptive to the events around him. He knew that the Kannada-speaking areas to the east of Bijapur, Bidar, Gulbarga, Raichur, etc., were part of the territory of the Nizam. And there was much love lost between Kannada and Telugu enthusiasts over the districts of Ballari and Adoni. There was also a great measure of anxiety between the 2 groups over the Tungabhadra Dam project near Hospete. These were current realities, but these realities were being given a historical color as well, with Kannada intellectuals claiming that the Vijayanagara Empire was a Kannada empire, and Telugu intellectuals calling it a Telugu empire. By the time he had finished his schooling, Kalburgi had positioned himself in the Kannada camp in opposition to the Telugu camp. Kannada had had disputes with the Tamil and Marathi since the 19th century. A dispute with Malayalam began in 1956. That's when the Fazl Ali Commission awarded Kasaragod to Kerala. Kalburgi did not take these disputes seriously. He was more interested in the quarrel with Telugu. In the course of his career, Kalburgi laid out the historical contours of a Kannada identity in general, mostly on its own terms, but on a number of occasions in opposition to Telugu. We see the beginnings of this in a paper that he wrote in 1954, about 6 months after the Fazlali Commission was set up. The paper was called Krishna Devaraya, the Invasion of Telugu Culture, Telugu Samskritiya Akramana. It was a brilliant paper. It is in fact a below average paper when you look at it objectively, but I call it brilliant because he was only 16 years old when he wrote it. And we can already see that he is questioning some of the most politically passionate pieces of wisdom. Krishna Devaraya was the paradigmatic emperor in popular imagination, not only in popular imagination, but also among Kannada intellectuals. That's the case even today. But at the age of 16, Kalburgi argued that Krishna Devaraya was the source of several of the trouble that Karnataka is facing today. He argued that the Sangama rulers ruled as deputies of the presiding deity of Hampi, Virupaksha. When the Saluvas came to power, the allegiance shifted to Rama. And with Krishna Devaraya of the Tuluva line, Venkatesha of Tirupati became the preeminent deity. Krishna Devaraya patronized Telugu poets more than Kannada poets. Himself wrote in Telugu, changed the landscape of Hampi by building such temples as the Vijaya Vittala and dotting the landscape with several other structures which made the Virupaksha temple appear almost insignificant. And these parts of Karnataka began to be flooded by Telugu speakers. Kalburgi concluded the paper with an observation. I have a translation with me here. Let me read it out for you. The ill effects of the anti-Kannada pro-Telugu policy that Krishnadevaraya inaugurated had led to the Ballari, Raichur and Koppala districts falling into Telugu hands. Business, politics, etc. are in their hands. Recently, the Telugus bought the vast areas of land from the Kannadigas to build the Tungabhadra Dam. In one sense, they did not buy the agricultural fields of the Kannadigas. They actually bought this land as such. Politically speaking, the Telugus administer the three districts as MLAs, MPs and presidents of Mandal Panchayats and Taluk Panchayats. The Telugus continue as teachers and priests at the Karnataka deity Virupaksha's temple. And all these have the roots in the opportunities which Krishna Devaraya opened up for them. This is Kalburgi writing when he was 16. His later works carried this sentiment forward, but with greater circumspection and with much greater scholarship. There was a strong element of Kannada chauvinism in his work, and some of his finest writings were often punctuated with rhetorical flourishes about Kannada. We noticed this, just give me a second. We can see this, for instance, in a very important paper he wrote on the evolution of the Kannada language. Here, he traces the history of Kannada from the inscriptions up to the time of Amogavarsha I, who ruled for a long time, who ruled for 6 decades in the 9th century, 814 to 878. The Kaviraja Margam was in fact written under his sponsorship. Kalburgi identified a set of changes in inscriptions after the time of the Kaviraja Margam. I don't recall all of them, but here are some of them. The Kannada Sanskrit ratio in the vocabulary of the inscription was 1:3 in earlier times. After the Kaviraja Margam, it becomes 1:1. Prashastis or royal eulogies used to be in Sanskrit. Now, there were Sanskrit eulogies, but there were also Sanskrit Prashastis in Kannada. All the inscriptions before the time of Kaviraja Margam, all Kannada inscriptions, cumulatively throw up only 60 verses. But now, up to 40% of every inscription was in verse. Rock surface inscriptions declined. the preferred medium now is polished stone tablets or temple walls. Inscriptions start deploying long Kannada compounds, long samasas, blending prose and verse like a Champu Kavya. These were some of the changes he identified. Kalburgi argued that this set of changes did not represent a natural evolution of the language. No, it was a conscious political initiative. And Kalburgi, being Kalburgi, he was ecstatic about this. He wrote that Amogavarsha in the north, the Ganga king Shivamara in the south, and the Vengi chief Gunaka Vijayaditya in the east stood as radiant guards, the Palakas, to nurture Kannada. In 1982, the renowned writer V.K. Gokak launched the Gokak agitation to make Kannada the official language of Karnataka. The agitation became very popular when the film actor Rajkumar got himself involved in it. Kalburgi was on the forefront of this movement. Kalburgi, Basavaraja Kattimani, Kalburgi's PhD supervisor R.C. Hiremat, Patil Puttappa, Chandrasekhar Patil. Kalburgi wrote hundreds of short papers, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages long, that gave us new information or new perspective on existing information. Sometimes he used this etymology-oriented method to change our understanding of historical facts completely, all in the space of 4 or 5 pages. You know, the 16th century poet Kanakadasa, for instance, is believed to be a Kuruba, shepherd by caste, and initiated into the Dvaita tradition of Ananda Tirtha. Kalburgi showed that he was in fact a Beda, hunter, who obtained Diksha in Vishishtadvaita, the Vishishtadvaita of Ramanuja. In another paper, he examined the history of a water tank in Hampi, the Manmatha Tirtha. There were locals who referred to this tank as Manmukha Tirtha, not Manmatha. Now, Kalburgi found a 12th century inscription in which the tank was actually called Manmukha. Now, he began to relate it to Manamukha Marga, one of the two divisions of the Natha tradition of Gorakhnath. The other division is Gurumukha Marga. He argued that Manmukha is actually Manamukha and that this was the sacred center of the Nathas. Now, around the water tank, there were images of Bhairavas belonging to the Nathas, but the clinching evidence came from an 11th century inscription in a temple, the Naganandishwara temple. And this inscription identifies the temple as Naganatheshwara. Naganatha is a very important figure in the Natha tradition, and most of the Naganatha temples belong to the Nathas. Elsewhere, Kalburgi presented very similar evidence to suggest that Kudala Sangama, a sacred place associated with Basava, was also a Natha center. He even pointed to the likelihood of Basava getting initiated into the Natha tradition. The original name of Kudala Sangama was Kappadi. Now, Kalburgi reflected upon the existing view that this word Kappadi comes from the Sanskrit Kapparti. He argued that Kappadi, which is Kappati in Dravidian morphology, was Sanskritized as Kappartin, and it's not the other way around. He links Kappadi to a class of people called Kappe or Kapperu. You find them in the inscriptions. Inscriptions speak of Kappera Bhatta, Kappera Chaundaya, and many more. You know, they also record land grants made for feeding the Kapperu. And literary evidence from Harihara primarily speaks of Nathas in Kudala Sangama. Not Nathas, but Naganatha. Basava himself says in one of his Vachana that he wore the robe of the Kappadis. Kappadi Veshadinda Bandaduve, that's there in one of his Vachana. Now, this is a brilliant analysis, but there is one piece of flaw in it. Kudala Sangama was home to the Kappadis, it was home to the Nathas as well. So much is clear from Kalburgi's analysis. But I'm not sure why he identifies the one with the other when there is no evidence to support this. They might as well be two different traditions located in the same place. We have Kalburgi doing this kind of exercise for a number of sacred centers. I cannot say if all of them are Natha centers. The Kodekalu tradition, for instance, is an Aruda tradition. Their sacred literature is kept in a specific location, concealed, in fact, not just kept. They do not circulate. But Kalburgi calls Kodaikkal another tradition. We come across such inaccuracies in a number of places. These are similar to some of the loose statements that we find in the writings of D.D. Kosambi. eh. Kosambi, for instance, writes that the place name Harappa occurs in the Rig Veda in the form of Hariyupiya. What he does not realize is that there are no place names in the Rig Veda. Besides, Harappa is the European spelling and pronunciation. The actual place name is Hadappa, and that's how it is still written in Hindi. There are no retroflex letters in European languages. So, Da becomes Ra. It's like Aroda becoming Aurora, the city Baroda becoming Baroda, and in South India it becomes Baroda. On one occasion, Kosambi wrote that Hallelujah was a war cry in West Asia, and that it is the same as Helayo Helaya that you have in Patanjali. Uh, Kalburgi was also prone to get into such flights of fantasy. When we overlook these inaccuracies, what we have is a completely different sacred geography vis-a-vis the picture that the trained historians have given us. The places here are not isolated sites, but connected with several others of the kind to form very intricate networks of pilgrimage. The picture that we get is something that a historian like Ramindranath Nandi, for instance, would never have imagined. Uh, uh, it's almost 1 o'clock. I'll now come to the last segment of the lecture. This is about a very specific theme that he had developed, where Basava and Kudala Sangama, that is to say the Lingayat faith, and Kalburgi's anti-Telugu sentiments, they come together here. And this, in my assessment, is the finest thesis on the history of religion we have in India. This investigation has its roots in the Virakta Aradhya divide that you have in Veerashaivism. These are two broad monastic divisions. There are further divisions within them. The Viraktas, popularly known as Sharanas or Banajigas, are dominant in North Karnataka. They do not endorse temple worship. The Matha is their preeminent institution. The Aradhyas, better known as Jangamas, are present in North Karnataka, but their dominance in terms of numbers is in the south. So there is a north-south divide that you can see here. The Matha is the most important institution for the Jangamas as well, but they practice temple worship too. The Sharanas don't. In fact, the priests in Kedarnath in Uttarakhand are Jangamas. The Lingayat or Veerashaiva faith consists of these two groups, the Viraktas or Sharanas and the Aradhyas or Jangamas. Lingayat and Veerashaiva are synonymous expressions, but the Sharanas have by convention identified themselves as Lingayats, and the Jangamas have preferred to call themselves Veerashaivas. In recent years, there has been a tendency to look at Lingayat and Veerashaiva as two different faiths altogether. When the demand for a separate minority status for Lingayats was made in 2017, there was a huge campaign, which I think many of you might recall. At that time, the Sharanas said that the Jangamas should not be part of this minority. Kalburgi did not make a conceptual distinction between Lingayat and Veerashaiva, but he left several clues in his writings to promote such a distinction. On one occasion, he said that the Lingayat is an Advaita tradition, non-dualist, whereas Veerashaiva is a Dvaita tradition, a dualist tradition, suggesting thereby that these were two different traditions. He was not favorably disposed towards the Jangamas. So there was a process through which he constructed very carefully the Jangama as the other of the Sharana. In doing so, he tried to show the primacy of the word Lingayat in historical terms, using his own method, tracing the geographical distribution as well as temporal distribution of the word Veerashaiva. Veerashaiva, Kalburgi argued, was a term which the Jangamas had popularized. He wrote two papers to discuss the history of the word. He showed that the 12th and 13th century poets, Harihara, Raghavanka, Kereya Padmarasa, Kumara Padmarasa, these poets never used the word Veerashaiva. The word occurs very rarely even in the Vachana literature, which is vast. We have more than 20,000 Vachanas. And where they do occur in the Vachanas, it is very easy to show that such Vachanas are spurious, produced in the 15th or 16th century or even later, and attributed to the 12th century saints. The first poet to use the word Veerashaiva was Palpurike Somanatha, who wrote the Basava Puranamu in Telugu in the 13th century. So the Telugu connections begin here. Somanatha used Veerashaiva as a synonym for Veera Maheshwara. There were four major Shaiva sects in South India: the Kalamukha, the Mahavrati, which was also called Kapalika, the Pashupata, which was also called Lakula Shaiva or Lakulisha, and the Maheshwara, which was variously identified as a Shaiva, Shuddha Shaiva, and Shrotriya. Somanatha recognized the saints, Basava and others, as brave or valorous Maheshwaras, Veera Maheshwara, and Veera Shaiva was a synonym for this word. It came to Karnataka when the poet Bhima composed the Basava Purana in Kannada in 1369. It was closely modeled after Somanatha's Telugu text. The use of the word Veera Shaiva in literary works was generally seen after the 15th century. It began in South Karnataka, where the Jangamas, who came from Andhra, promoted the use of the word. Its use in North Karnataka was much later. As a popular usage, the Sharanas had used the word Lingayat to identify themselves. Veera Shaiva was not a popular expression in North Karnataka. In fact, its popularity dates back only to the year 1903, when the Veera Shaiva Mata Pracharaka Sangha was established in Dharwad. Kalburgi was arguing that in historical terms, the word Lingayat was older and much more important than Veera Shaiva. Now, who are the Lingayats in historical terms? I had written a short paper a couple of years ago where I had discussed this question briefly. There I had called this the Kalburgi thesis. I'll read out 2 or 3 paragraphs from it, and I'll end my talk with that. This is what Kalburgi had to say. The origins of the Lingayats in the 12th century was closely tied to the history of Shaivism and its caste prejudices. Shaivism appeared in 3 forms: the Vedic tradition influenced by Shankara's Advaita, cults such as the Natha, and Agamic traditions that were subjected to considerable Vedic influence. Within Karnataka, the third of these had the largest following. Traditions belonging to this class proliferated in different parts of India, and their number, as recorded in texts such as Suprabhedagama, Sukshmagama, Vatula Shuddhagama, Parameshwaragama, Chandrajnanagama, and Viragama, ranged from 4 to 28. 4 of them had followers in Karnataka: the Kalamukas, the Mahavratis or the Kapalikas, the Pashupatas or the Lakulishas, and the Shuddha Shaiva or Shrotriya, that is the Maheshwaras. Kalburgi tells us how to identify them from inscription. This is very important. Monasteries identified as Simha Parshe, Shakti Parshe, Parvatavali, and Bhujangavali belong to the Kalamukas. Names that had Rashi Pandita, Jiya, Shakti, and such words suffixed to them indicate Pashupata affiliation. Bhitarashi Pandita, for example. So Bhitarashi belongs to the Pashupata sect. And names that had Soma for a suffix belong to the Mahavratis. Shrita Soma. If you come across the name, that means that he is a member of the Mahavratis sect. These were the 3 widely popular Shaiva traditions in Karnataka. All 3 were to eventually wither away. The 4th tradition, Shrotriya or Maheshwara, had teachers whose names carried suffixes such as Shambhu, as in Soma Shambhu, or Shiva, as in Vishveshwara Shiva, or Shivacharya, as in Ishana Shivacharya. It was a marginal group, but the most influential and numerous Shaivites in contemporary Tamil Nadu and Andhra belonged to the Maheshwaras. Inscriptions from Karnataka identify the sage Durvasa as the founder of the Shrotriya tradition. The same is said in Siddha Somananda's Shivadrishti and Tantralokatika concerning Trika Shaivism of Kashmir, which makes it likely that the Shrotriyas or the Maheshwaras originated in Kashmir and was in effect the same as Trika with its principle of Pashu, Pasha and Pati. As late as the 15th century, Veerashaiva teachers in Karnataka were found tracing their origins to Durvasa. The first clear reference to a Shrotriya from the Karnataka Maharashtra region dates back to the year 959. A Rashtrakuta inscription of that year records the gift of a village to Gagana Shiva, the disciple of Ishana Shiva. The Shrotriyas who moved into South India belonged to the Golaki Matha, established by Bhavashambhu near Tripuri in Madhya Pradesh on the land granted by the Kalachuri king Yuvaraja I. In the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, they spread across Tamil Nadu and Andhra. Patronage from the Chola and the Kakatiya state made their presence invincible. They persecuted Jainas and Sri Vaishnavas in Tamil Nadu and took control of Sri Shailam from the Pashupatas in Andhra. A few Golaki Matha establishments might have come into being in Karnataka as well, one of which was found in Puligere. Puligere is Lakshmeshwara. The Shrotriyas were Brahmins and an orthodox lot given to exploitation and violence. Emblematic of their deep caste prejudices is an inscription from Karadikallu in the Raichur district, which carries the order of a certain Sukshma Shiva, prohibiting members of the lower castes, Antyajati, from traveling in carriages through the market street on the occasion of their marriage, and prescribing a fine of 12 gadyanas for those violating the order. It was against these prejudices that Basava, born in a Shrotriya Brahmin family, rebelled in the 12th century. He inaugurated the new faith of the Sharanas and admitted members into it through a rite of initiation, which in most cases was a re-initiation, punardiksha, of those already initiated into other Shaiva traditions. The new faith promoted the worship of Ishtalinga and the rejection of rituals, hierarchies, and biases based on caste and gender. A section of the people from Kalamukha, Pashupata, and Mahavrati traditions became Sharanas, but Shrotriyas, that is Maheshwaras, were the greatest in numbers to convert to the new faith. Basava's influence was also felt on the matas of all four traditions. Their pontiffs evolved as Jangamas in Karnataka and as Aradhyas in Andhra. The Aradhyas of Andhra were Shrotriyas and continued to adhere to Brahmanism, caste hierarchies, and ritualism, their interest in Basava being confined only to the new practice of worshipping the Ishtalinga. Mallikarjuna Pandita Aradhya was their chief representative. In the 15th and the 16th centuries, the Aradhyas of Andhra moved to southern Karnataka, where they found acceptance. Here, they appropriated the remnants of the old Kalamukha, Pashupata, and Mahavrati sects and cults such as the Natha and set into motion a new tradition that accepted Basava's Ishtalinga worship but otherwise remained largely Brahmin in orientation. The new tradition revolved around the figures of Panditaradhya, a Shrotriya, and three others who were modeled after him as Aradhyas. That is Revana Siddha or Revanaradhya, Ekantarama or Ekorama Radhya, and Marula Siddha, Marula Radhya. Kalburgi does not tell us which of the three is the Kalamukha, which one is the Mahavrati, and which one is the Pashupata. But thus came into being the tradition of the four Acharyas, which with the inclusion of Vishwaradhya in the 17th century became the Panchacharya tradition, the Jangama tradition. And Vishwaradhya Matha has its seat not in Karnataka or Andhra, but in Kashi, Varanasi. The Nayakas of Keladi built this Matha. This, in a nutshell, is the Kalburgi thesis on the origins of the Lingayas. Its novelty lies in bringing into relief the Shrotriya tradition and the metamorphosis of a part of it into the Virakta or Sharana tradition, and the transformation of the four Shaiva sects into the Aradhya or Jangama tradition, which opens up a completely new avenue for exploring the evolution of Shaivism in Karnataka between the 12th and the 16th centuries. It's a pity that nobody in the academia even knows about this thesis. The merits of the thesis notwithstanding, its larger structure is a bit contentious because Kalburgi was simply reading contemporary prejudices back in time without producing evidence to the effect that the relationship between the Jangamas and the Sharanas were fraught with friction all the time. The structural incompatibility between the two groups is argued on the basis of the ideals that informed the putative moment of historical origins, which, as it turns out, is inaccurate because Kalburgi takes it to the 12th century, but we don't see this happening before the 15th and 16th century. To that extent, the thesis's claims to historicity cannot be taken seriously. It would have been wonderful had Kalburgi explored how the respective histories of the two groups unfurled. But whether or not it happened in the 12th century or the 15th and the 16th century, the story of how the Pashupata, Kalamukha, Mahavrati, and Maheshwara sects transform into the Sharanas and the Jangamas in Karnataka and Andhra is, for me, the most fascinating story in the history of religious life in India that a scholar has told. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Manu.